GGDA is the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency. In the past year, on June, the JEDA, which was Gauteng Economic Development Agency, as well as Blue IQ, were merged to form this one entity called the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency. This is an implementing arm of the Department of Economic Development. Its primary responsibilities and role is to drive growth of the economy of Gauteng through ensuring that the global city region is envisaged in Gauteng. But we do that by trade and investment facilitation, as well as in terms of a strategic economic infrastructure.
There's a lot of information doing the rounds, and information obviously informs decision making. And we're very happy to learn in recent weeks that the Nigerian economy, based on something called rebasing, has now been found to be 60% bigger than South Africa's economy. And all along we thought that we are number one when it comes to the size and so on of the economy. But I've got smart people who are going to talk to us this morning, who are going to explain what the key drivers of this rebasing are all about, and the model that it is based on, and all of the elements that are helping the Nigerian economy grow. And we are also going to look at where the synergies lie, the complementarities, and where possible collaborations exist between the South African economy as well as the Nigerian economy. So that's the focus of our discussion this morning. And I hope with your participation we will be able to craft a common view of how we can grow Africa's economy together. Right? As you know, South Africa is still a major player in the Southern African region anyway, and the Nigeria a major player in West Africa, and Kenya a major player in East Africa. So when you put all of those things together, you know, we can do more, obviously. So that's the tone of the discussion and the focus of this morning's events. We are being hosted here by GDDA, and the CEO is Mr. Spiwe Ngwenya. If you are running short of water or you need tea and so forth, and you've not been provided with those types of things, you can blame him for that. All right. So I'm going to ask him to come and welcome us before we hear from the MC. Thank you.
South Africa is sitting on a time bomb as the economy slides. So said the Times newspaper in 2013. ANC to blame for Nigeria overtaking us. So said Tim Harris, the shadow minister of finance, in April 2014. The two headlines I've just mentioned are just snapshots of what you are likely to see if you browse the mainstream media and the websites of political parties in South Africa today. Alongside this perspective is the notion that while economies in sub-Saharan Africa are growing at 6% on average, South Africa is a tower whose collapse is imminent. This sentiment was captured more aptly by The Economist with the following headlines displayed on its cover in 2013. Said South Africa, cried the beloved country. South Africa is sliding downhill while much of the rest of the continent is clawing its way up. When Nigeria took the decision to rebase its economy and include previously discounted sectors such as telecommunications and financial services, as well as new sectors like the film industry, or what is popularly known as Nollywood, on April 6 this year, many commentators and analysts use this as an opportunity to ring alarm bells about the state of South Africa's economy and argue that this development will adversely alter South Africa's investment rankings. Although hydrocarbons are still by far the most dominant sectors of Nigeria's economy, the rebasing of Nigeria's GDP has revealed that its economy is more diversified and less dependent on primary commodities than it was in 1990. This is certainly good news for Nigeria, an economy of 170 million people, 40 million of which belong to the middle strata, inspires confidence. This is why we refuse to march to this negative tune and are delighted by these developments. A prosperous Nigeria makes the whole of Africa a better place to live in. It is generally accepted that for South Africa to grow faster, and even more importantly to create jobs, we need to consolidate our manufacturing sector and improve our export performance, especially of value-added products. South African companies could and should benefit from this economic growth spurt if we leveraged it through strengthening business links. South African companies already have significant investments in the Nigerian economy, particularly in the retail and telecommunication sectors, and need to grow their presence with a view to opening up access to the broader economic community of West African states, or what is popularly known as ECOWAS. We should see this development within the framework of the Abuja Treaty of African Union, which posits that for Africa's economic integration to be realized, it will have to be anchored by strong regional economies that assume leadership on both economic and politics of their regions. Ultimately, the rebasing of Nigeria's economy simply confirms its status as a dynamic growth market. It reinforces the broad African growth story and positions Nigeria and South Africa as complementary regional economics and investment hubs for West Africa and Southern Africa, respectively. This is reason for celebration rather than anxiety. But the negative discourse creates a false dichotomy between a South Africa on a downward slope and a Nigeria on the rise. This discourse also creates the impression that South Africa is the biggest loser when it comes to Africa's growth story. From where I am standing, the story about Nigeria's GDP and the changing fortunes of the African continent are two sides of the same coin. I want to advance the argument that South Africa is neither a loser nor a competitor in the narrative. To the contrary, our country stands to accrue massive gains from the continent's growth story. After all, in our foreign policy and economic engagements in the continent, we have always maintained that South Africa cannot be an island of prosperity in a sea of poverty. In other words, as an African country, there is an umbilical cord that ties us to the rest of the continent. Africa's time has come, and our continent is indeed the next growth frontier after Asia. Already many economies throughout Africa are growing significantly. From Mozambique, across the border of Angola, from Ethiopia to Ghana, African economies are on the boil. We should be encouraged that the cardinal role that we have played and continue to play in championing the African agenda is starting to bear fruit. Programs such as the new Partnership for Africa's Development, called popularly known as NEPAD, are grounded on this realization. Moreover, I want to posit that South Africa is both a protagonist and a beneficiary of Africa's growth. This means that the dichotomy between booming economies in the continent and South Africa is a false one. And so is the notion that Nigeria's GDP rebasing is a confirmation that South Africa is a limping giant. To start with, let me use the economist's rather pessimistic outlook of South Africa as a specimen and demonstrate to you why such logic is fundamentally flawed. I am of the view that we should not be surprised by the publication's tone about the country and its direction. The headline, Africa, the Hopeless Continent, which was the lead story for one of the editions of the magazine in the year 2000, has been proven dramatically wrong. We cannot let these views go unchallenged. While naysayers and their perceptions about the state of South Africa are now treated as articles of faith, there is compelling evidence that actually tells a radically different story. A 2013 survey by Ernst & Young, Ernst & Young, which drew participation from over 500 investors and business leaders from 38 countries around the world, found that South Africa leads the pack as the most preferred destination for investors. An impressive 41% of the investors that participated in this survey ranked South Africa in the #1 spot, while 60% ranked it #3 in the continent. This was far ahead of the forerunner Morocco, which was ranked second by 8% of the respondents. Contrary to what the prophets of doom are saying, the survey demonstrates that South Africa has experienced robust growth in foreign direct investment in recent years. Likewise, capital and project investment grew substantially through the worst economic crisis at 25% and 29% respectively. And this is well above the average growth in foreign direct investment for most economies in the continent. The UNCTAD Global Investment Trends Monitor also revealed a 10% year-on-year growth in FDI inflows in South Africa in 2012. This growth in investment was recorded in the context of declining investment globally, with our BRIC counterparts recording negative investment levels. And while it is true that economies in the continent are growing at a far higher rate than ours, we must remember that these economies are growing from a much lower base. That we must remember. Importantly, South Africa is also playing an important role as a source of FDI for many economies in the continent, and was the single largest investor of FDI project in the rest of Africa in 2012. Okay. There are currently approximately 45 investment projects in Nigeria from South Africa with a total market capitalization of $4.2 billion. Collectively, these projects, which are mainly in the telecommunications, food retail, banking, for instance, Standard Bank Group and First Rand are there, hospitality, Sun International is there, have created approximately 7,164 permanent employments in Nigeria. Similarly, South Africa's comparative advantage in terms of infrastructure, financial system, telecommunications, and overall infrastructure, plus the fact that we have one of the largest stock exchanges in the world, makes us a stable platform from which to invest in the rest of the continent. Our growing working age population, natural resources, macroeconomic stability, diversified economy, and our willingness to engage in long-term planning are factors counting in our favor. And therefore, this story for me cannot be classified as negative, even for ourselves. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, as we will be engaging, let me just indicate that South Africa and Nigeria share similar apprehensions caused by widespread inequalities, unsettling levels of poverty and joblessness, especially amongst young people. And this takes us to the age-old debate about growth versus redistribution and whether GDP is an adequate measure of development. Our shared realities of poverty, unemployment, and inequality enjoin us to continue to work together to put our economies on growth trajectories that address these challenges. Those who have chosen to be negative about Nigeria having a bigger economy ignore the massive spin-offs that this reality presents for our own situation. It also exposes ignorance about how investment decisions are arrived at. South Africa and Nigeria are not in a tussle or contest. What we need to focus on is improving the domestic investment climate and opening up mutually beneficial trade links in the continent at large. And this position is a South African position. It's not just a Gauteng position. We have taken decision to ensure that Africa is stable. Militarily, politically, we are going to ensure that Africa is stable economically. We will ensure that that which was spoken about by our leaders, including President Thabo Mbeki, is realized. All of us will ensure that Africa grows, and that will be of benefit to all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, MEC, for giving us a sense of how South Africa deals with this matter and what the position of the country is. Now, I am going to call on a man who will be telling me or telling us more about the fundamentals underlying the Nigerian economy, the elements that make up the 60% size, on the basis of rebasing, the 60% extra that has been added to the economy that makes it bigger than the South African economy. That's Chris Becker, who's an economic strategist with ETM Analytics.
Sure, thanks. My friends have actually referred to me as the whispering economist before, so I was getting worried about you guys hearing in the back, but closer. So that's the perspective and the angle that I look at these markets in sub-Saharan Africa at. The level of analysis is very much at a top-down, macro strategic level. So we're trying to understand the environment, trying to fit the pieces of the data puzzles together that comes from both official and private sector sources, being company financials and so on. and trying to make sense of what's going on there. As you know, in sub-Saharan Africa, there are historically some deep data constraints. Official data is often not timeous, it's unreliable. There are issues around how the data is measured, because the nature of these economies is also very different to your more Western developed economies, where it's a lot easier to capture where your tax base is essentially close to 100%. You are able to pick up data and intelligence out of the macroeconomy a lot better in the Western economies. In sub-Saharan Africa, that is not the case, and a lot of the trade that happens in sub-Saharan Africa, as you well know, is happening in the informal sector. So there are all sorts of constraints and challenges for statistical bureaus to send staff out into the field and trying to make a really good really good data sense of what's happening in these economies. And Nigeria is no different. In fact, it's probably more of a concern in Nigeria because it's such a massive economy with so much people, and there's so much activity naturally that is happening between all those 180 million people in the country. Now, the Nigerian gross domestic product was, as you know, hasn't been updated since 1990. So after a couple of delays and a couple of years of working on this, the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics has this year released that updated GDP figure. And it essentially has just captured sectors that didn't exist around 1990 and included that into the data. So the film industry, called Nollywood in Nigeria, the IT sector, which has grown tremendously in Nigeria. Those are two of the key sectors that have been now included in the data. And that's boosted GDP as you would expect it to do. However, as I pointed out, there's still some issues around using GDP as the best metric of trying to understand what's going on in the economy. To give you an example, even with the latest GDP that has been released, we've seen extremely weak nominal GDP growth in Nigeria in the last couple of years. I say last couple of years because it's mostly in the last year or two. Since 2000 or 1995, we've seen trend nominal GDP growth in Nigeria of around 16 or 15%, which is exceptionally strong. In 2013, we saw that rate of growth slow down to 3%. Now, also, just to backtrack a bit for people who aren't economists, essentially what GDP captures is income and profits in the economy, is essentially a proxy measure of what it's looking at. When you're looking at the income approach of GDP, it's really measuring income on an economy-wide basis. And what that data is saying is that in 2013, the rate of income growth in Nigeria has slowed down to 3% off of a rate of 16%. Meanwhile, the National Bureau of Statistics is still reporting positive real GDP growth of 7 or 8%. So you're seeing nominal GDP of 3%, real GDP of 7 or 8%, which means that the inflation rate that they're using to calculate real GDP is actually in a very steep deflation. And to me, that was immediately a big question mark, because the companies that I speak to and the investors that I speak to and the locals in Nigeria that I speak to are all saying that prices are rising. And in fact, the Consumer Price Index, also reported by the National Bureau of Statistics, is reporting an inflation rate of around 8 or 9%. So immediately there's a big gap in the GDP data and the national accounts data, which has been a massive question mark to myself and some of my clients. Now, one of the issues and how you try and verify what's happening in the Nigerian economy, not only looking at the official data that's being released, is to look at company financials, financial sector data. Companies are being audited. Often they're listed in the Nigerian market. They have to be audited and report accurate financials. And if you look at Cadbury, Unilever, or Guinness, in the first quarter of this year, they've seen revenue contracting, falling by between 10 and 20% in the last year. And profitability has taken a huge knock as well. If you look at the cost of sale data, it also shows inflation rates. So there's massive margin squeeze. It's leading to profitability declines in the Nigerian market. And what the private sector data is showing doesn't match up with what's being reported on by the National Bureau of Statistics.
We will be looking at the sectors that drive or define the two economies in the first place. Let's focus on that. But on the other hand is the impact of the size and the growth of these economies on the quality of life of the citizens, right? Your typical challenges of inequality, poverty, and so on. What is your view, given what we've been told?
This is not about competition. You know, that I think one of the most difficult issues for South Africa is that, as the MEC said, we're very rich relative to our neighbors. So if you look at the BRICS, all the other BRICS countries, their GDP per capita is about less than 1.5 times the GDP per capita of their regions. Our GDP per capita is 7 times the GDP of our regions. And I think that's clearly a limiting factor on balanced development and has all sorts of social implications around migration and so on as well. And so we can only be happy if our countries in the region turn out to be richer than we thought. Although, as people have pointed out, it's not that they've become richer. It's that the statistics have recognized their riches. But I do think that what it says is Africa has huge potential for us. And we as a country, as the MEC said, if we don't work to develop our region and make sure that we're now in a good neighborhood for growth ourselves and are proactive around that we can't grow ourselves. So a competitive paradigm is actually no help at all. Having said that, and I think maybe this is what you were getting at, both Nigeria and ourselves, we have commodity-based economies. And that has a lot of very negative implications. In terms of path to